Hello students, this is Mr. Martyron with a bonus flip classroom on how to write your DBQ. So by now we have examined the documents, we've examined the evidence, you have annotated all the evidence, you know exactly what you need to write, you know exactly what you need to prove. Now it's time to simply just sit down and do it. So if you are struggling, this video may come in handy. So the first thing you want to do is write your introduction. And the introduction is going to be the first impression that that I will have to evaluate you on. So a couple things that I'm looking for. Okay, number one, you need to establish background. Okay, you have to tell your audience, what are you writing about? Okay, and in this instance, we're writing about how man's view of the world changed between the Renaissance and the Middle Ages. So you want to include pertinent information. For example, what time period are you writing about? So in this instance, we're writing about Europe in the 1200s all the way up to the 1600s. You may want to include why the Renaissance began in Italy. You may want to mention that we saw an increase in commerce and trade brought back from the Middle East. And then you want to define any words or terms. So, if you throw out the term Renaissance there, you want to identify that this was the time period where renewed interest in classical learning was brought back. If you're throwing out the term Middle Ages, you want to define Middle Ages as, the time period between between ancient and the modern time period. If you're throwing out anything about like the scientific revolution or indulgences or anything of that, you have to assume that the audience that's going to be reading this paper really doesn't know a whole lot about what you're writing about. And that will also help you develop a little bit of specificity. And again, the main idea here when you're establishing your background is you're laying the foundation for everything that you're going to write about in your paper. Once you have your background established, that's when you drop your thesis statement. And this thesis statement we've done in class. This is the thesis statement that you're going to use. The Renaissance changed man's view of the world in at least 3 ways. There was an emphasis on individualism, people embraced life in the present, and reason prevailed over religion. I know each individual class may have a variation of what that thesis is, but that's the gist of what you are writing. And then finally, you want to allude to the main points or categories that develop and support your thesis. And that's kind of where the roadmap comes into play. You want to kind of tease the audience with what you're going to be writing about in your paper. You want to show how man's view of the world changed via individualism, people embracing life in the present, and how reason prevailed over religion, without getting too specific, because that's what obviously your paper is for. So a good introduction is going to set the tone for the rest of your paper. Now the body paragraphs. And you're going to replicate this 3 times because you need 3 body paragraphs, 1 for each piece of evidence. So the first thing you need is a topic sentence. Okay, and what I refer to as the baby thesis. This will tell your audience what each paragraph is about. The best way to do this is if you want to simplify your thesis and break it down. So you could say something to the effect that the Renaissance changed man's view of the world because there was an increase in individualism, period. The Renaissance changed man's view of the world because there was a movement for people to live life in the present, period. And again, you can adapt your own variations of it, but what you're doing is you're breaking the thesis down into 3 separate components. That way, each paragraph will have its own unique, quote, baby thesis, which is going to tell the audience what it's about. After your topic sentence, then you're going to have evidence supporting details from the documents. And when you are done directly citing or using the documents, you will cite it. And this is how you cite it. Open parentheses, DOC, period, and then whatever letter you're citing it from, A, B, C, or D. Close parentheses, period. Whenever you use a document directly, you must cite it. All right? And then the third part of your paragraph is going to be the argument. And this is really important because this is how you connect the evidence to your thesis. So a lot of times what I've seen in DBQ's past is that people will have a good topic sentence, they will use the evidence, but then they won't draw the connection between the evidence and then the thesis. So in other words, rather than in this instance, this document A is about, we said, Renaissance art and how it embodies individualism and humanism and all the rest. What ends up happening is I get essays written about how art changed, but not how that's reflective of the larger picture. So again, you want to ask yourself, how did the changes in art show that during the Renaissance, man's view of the world was changing? And you want to do that with each and every one of your paragraphs. You want to show, how did poetry show that the Renaissance was changing man's view of the world? You want to ask yourself, how did the changes in astronomy and science show that during the Renaissance, man's view of the world was changing? You want to ask yourself that question with each of the 4 documents. All right, an example for a body paragraph outline, you're going to have your baby thesis. And here I have it. I've simplified it for you. The Renaissance celebrated individuality. Boom. So I know that this paragraph is going to be about individuality and humanism. All right. Next, you're going to provide evidence. And again, I've boiled this down into a very simple paragraph for you. So, baby thesis, the Renaissance celebrated individuality. And then the evidence is medieval art, mainly religious, not realistic. Few facial features. The baby looks like a man. Now notice I am using this information directly from document A. So that's where I throw in the citation. And then additionally, because document A compared medieval art with Da Vinci's Mona Lisa, Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa looks like a real person. For example, shading, natural folds in clothing, mysterious human expression, period. So again, anytime you use the evidence directly, you have to cite it. Once you're done using the evidence directly, then you build your argument. And this focus, and the argument here is the focus on detail reflected new interest in the human individual, real-life personalities. So now this will enable you, once you start answering the question about how art proves that man's view of the world changed, you can now write about humanism and individualism and secularism and everything else that you want to write about that you already know about. All right, so this more or less is how your paragraphs will flow. Baby thesis or topic sentence, you provide your evidence, and then you build your argument. You use the evidence to prove the point that man's view of the world changed during the Renaissance. Once you have written your 3 body paragraphs, then it's time to wrap it up and write your conclusions. Now, a couple things about conclusions. You don't want to argue anything new in the conclusion. You don't want to bring in new evidence. And you don't want to try and connect it to something that you haven't made a connection about. So, first things first, you want to start with the concluding phrase. I know some teachers tell you not to, some teachers tell you to do so. DBQs are kind of bland and boring. So you can start with, in conclusion, finally, in the final analysis, anything that signifies to your audience that you are, in fact, drawing your conclusions and ending your paper. Next, you want to restate your thesis. In conclusion, the Renaissance changed man's view of the world in at least 3 ways. You're recapping everything that you proved in your paper. And then kind of the thing that I think is harder for students to grasp is this last point here. You want to put your essay in a larger historical perspective. Now, I'm not necessarily saying you need to connect it to the world today, but the sentence that I've written out here is, the Renaissance, with its emphasis on world and human potential, marked the beginning of the modern era. And while religion remained important for centuries to come, the Catholic Church monopoly on what was a serious challenge for the first time. So again, this sentence, it's a nice closing sentence because it recaps what the Renaissance was without adding really any new evidence. Everything in this sentence that I've given you has been proven in your paper. So don't dwell on the conclusion, and if it sounds like it ends abruptly, that's almost, I want to say, okay, because it shouldn't kind of go on and on and on. And I think that's the problem a lot of freshmen have, is they're trying to write this conclusion, they're trying to end it on a high note, and they just can't find the sentence just to end it on. So here is a really good example. The Renaissance, with its emphasis on world and human potential, marked the beginning of the modern era. And while religion remained important for centuries to come, the Catholic Church's monopoly on knowledge was seriously challenged for the first time. Easy enough. All right. And then the final thing I'll say, once you have your introduction, your 3 body paragraphs, and your conclusions, you want to have it proofread. Excuse me. So number 1, you want to make sure that your paper is in MLA format. Like I said, if you're writing this on Google Classroom or Microsoft Word or Mac or whatever, when you go to print it out, when you go to submit it, It's your responsibility to make sure the formatting is perfect. Ms. Alexander and I have gone over that several times. Make sure no personal pronouns in your paper. All right, this is a simple and correctable mistake. All you have to do is hit Control F, and you can type in any one of these words, and it will show you anytime that you used a personal pronoun. Your paper needs to be written in the third person objective voice. All right. Another thing that I've noticed, grading these papers, you need to have transitions between ideas and paragraphs. You want to show that your paper flows. So here's a list of all sorts of great transitional words. And, in addition to, furthermore, moreover, besides, then, to, also, both, and, another, equally important, first, second, again, further, last, finally, not only, but also, as well as, in second place, next, likewise, similarly, in fact, as a result, consequently, in the same way. For example, for instance. These are all great transition words that you can use not just when you're transitioning between paragraphs, but also when you're transitioning between ideas, thoughts, and analysis. All right. And the final thing I'll just say is make sure you use smart word choice. You don't need to use the great, have a sophisticated language that's, years above your reading level. But avoid phrases like shows, says, talks about, because none of these documents are, maybe the paintings you could argue you could use the word shows, but none of these documents are talking or saying anything. That's your interpretation. So a smart language will really enhance your paper, because just as a little hint, lots of times what happens is students with poor grammatical errors or all sorts of misspellings, that really takes away from your paper, and teachers spend more time grading the mistakes and the nitty-gritty than they do looking at the big picture, which all of you clearly understand how this thesis can be proven. All right. If you have any questions, you can watch this video again. Hopefully this is helpful as you're writing the DBQ. If you have any questions, you can always email me, or you can post on Google Classroom. Thanks a lot, guys. Good luck.